This is the Wet Lunch on the High Seas podcast with historian Stephen Ujifusa. Business, history, and culture with a nautical twist. This is a special episode for me because yesterday, thanks to Lynnewood Hall Preservation Society Executive Director Ed Tome and my friend and board member Max Kaiserman, I was able to get a special visit to a building that has real special significance in business and maritime history. This was the home of Peter Arrow Brown Widener, who was one of the leading venture capitalists of the Gilded Age. He was the founder of the Philadelphia Traction Company, which made its fortune developing trolley lines throughout the city of Philadelphia. He took that fortune that he earned in the late 19th century and partnered with J.P. Morgan to form U.S. Steel, American Tobacco, and the International Mercantile Marine. Peter L. Brown Widener was a self-made man. He was the son of a German-American bricklayer, and he started off his career as a butcher. And he, during the mid-19th century, looked like many other tradesmen who operated small stores in the Philadelphia area. And eventually he got a large contract to supply the Union Army with mutton during the Civil War. And that's how he got his first wad of capital in $50,000 in the 1860s, which is about the equivalent of $1 million. And he very smartly, aggressively took that money and invested in many other enterprises, most notably a near monopoly of Philadelphia's trolley line system that started off with horse cars in the 1850s and 1860s, and by the 1890s, the development of the electric storage battery and also power lines, electric power lines, allowed these trolley lines to be electrified and eliminating the needs for costly horses and therefore also animal abuse. These electric trolley lines allowed Philadelphia to spread further north and south and west. And this system was also used in cities such as Chicago and also London. Peter Widener was also an investor in what became the New York subway system. The house that he built for his family that still survives, it was designed by the architect Horace Trumbauer between 1897 and 1899. And he built it shortly after the death of his wife, Hannah Josephine Widener. And he made a conscious decision that he wanted to build a compound outside of Philadelphia where he could have 3 generations of his family living under one roof. And it was also be a place for his art collection. Peter Widener was someone who, although he never went to college, was in the tradition of self-made men of culture. Most notably, an example I can think about is Albert Ballin, who was his rough contemporary, also a big-time person in the shipping business. Albert Ballin had to drop out of school at 17 to work in his father's ticketing agency and eventually rose to be head of the Hamburg America line. But Albert Ballin built a not quite as large but similarly elegant villa in Hamburg that showcased his taste. And Peter L. Brown Widener, on this side of the Atlantic, had a similar, very refined sense of taste and elegance. And in selecting the architect Horace Trumbauer, Trumbauer was someone who, like Peter Widener, came from a humble background. This is a time when architects did not really go to architecture school per se. The first architecture programs in America were set up at MIT and the University of Pennsylvania, but those weren't up and running until the 1890s. Horace Trumbauer was someone who learned on the job, learned by doing as an apprentice. And according to Lynnewood's executive director, Ed Tome, these two men, Widener and Trumbauer, got each other. They understood what it meant to be outsiders who were self-made. And Trumbauer was someone who has made a name for himself designing suburban developments in places like Mount Airy and Overbrook Farms and Wayne on the Main Line. But Lynnewood Hall was his first really large-scale commission that set him apart as an architect to design French-inspired neoclassical homes in the Philadelphia suburbs and eventually also in New York and Newport, Rhode Island. His most trusted co-worker was an African-American, Julian Abel, who was trained at the University of Pennsylvania and was responsible for many of the French details that Trumbauer incorporated into the firm's work, especially in the interiors. And the Widener family occupied this house from 1899 until Peter Widener's son, Joseph Early Widener, died in 1947. This house, for about 15 years, was the site of family gatherings, balls and parties. It was also the late childhood home of Peter Widener's grandson, Harry Widener. Harry Elkins Widener was Harvard class of 1907. He really didn't want to go into the family business. He didn't have to. But like a lot of wealthy young men of his time, especially Philadelphians, he had a real love of book collecting. And he amassed one of the largest and most valuable collections of rare books in the United States. Pretty incredible for a 20-something young man. This mirrored his uncle Joseph Early Widener's love of art and collecting old masters and his grandfather's collection of old masters. Lynnewood Hall at its peak had a large collection of Van Dycks and Rembrandts that were Peter Widener's and the Widener family's pride and joy. This house, although used for entertaining, was basically a stage for Peter Widener's business interests and career. He attracted and invited many capitalists and notable names of the Gilded Age. On the guest book, you see names such as Guggenheim and Vanderbilt, Drexel. He was a mover and shaker. He loved getting things done, and he loved investing in new enterprises. The Wideners, Peter Widener in particular, was not particularly interested in Philadelphia high society. In fact, they were snubbed by the old money crowd, but he frankly didn't mind. At his death in 1915, he was worth over $100 million, which is multiple billions of dollars in today's money. Eventually, the Wideners would marry into old Philadelphia, but many of the younger generation of Wideners never forgot that snub. But Peter Widener was kind of like Cornelius Vanderbilt in that he kind of did what he wanted, associated with who he found interesting, and was a very dynamic personality. A very aggressive businessman, you had to be back then. But he was also someone who had a very keen aesthetic eye. And the great tragedy of his life after the death of his wife was the death of his son, George Dunton Widener, and his grandson, Harry Elkins Widener, in the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. This is a ship that Widener was part owner of through the International Mercantile Marine. And he was never quite the same after this family tragedy. There was kind of a Widener curse. But the house passed into the hands of his son, Joseph Early Widener, who maintained it to the highest Gilded Age standards until his death in 1943. And then the family decided it was just too massive to maintain. I mean, this house was, I believe, 75,000 square feet. It's the second largest surviving home in the United States, arguably, after Biltmore, possibly Oheka Castle, built by Otto Hermann Kahn in the 1920s. I'm not exactly sure on that, but it's definitely among the top 2 or 3. And the house passed through several owners and was most recently used as a seminary. And it was just purchased recently by the Lynnewood Hall Preservation Society, which is making plans to gradually clean out, stabilize, and restore this monumental structure. But thanks to Ed Tome and my friends Max Kaiserman and the current generation, Peter Widener, I was able to gain access, along with some friends, to Lynnewood Hall. And although it is run down on the outside and has suffered from years of deferred maintenance, the quality of the construction of this building has allowed it to stand the test of time. And a few of the highlights for me visiting Lynnewood Hall were the playing of the Blue Danube Waltz in the main atrium, which was designed for this sort of music. The acoustics in there were fantastic. Also having whiskey and playing billiards in the smoking room, which is pretty much intact, including its French-style, Louis XV style paneling. That was an incredible experience. You knew in this room, this is where a lot of the movers and shakers of the early 20th century came to gather. And at that time, the estate was comprised of about 300 acres. So you were pretty much surrounded by nature, not like today where the house is encroached on by suburban development. And also getting to look at Harry Widener's bedroom, which is where he spent his 20s until he perished on the Titanic along with his father. And I think that the thing that I came away with was, and this touches on my previous podcast, is that Peter Widener was a magnate who was not just building empty buildings just to impress people on the outside. The inside of his house was meant to have real substance. This included his art collections, the furniture he accumulated. This was not just an ego trip. This was meant to be a home for his family and a place for art and beauty and design. And I really wonder whether today's billionaire class, are they building something meant to last generations, aside from money and aside from publicity? Time will tell, but Peter Widener, when he built this house with Horace Trumbauer's design, was planning to build something that would last forever, would hopefully be a family home for generation upon generation. It only lasted 2 or so generations before it just became too big to maintain. And it is an interesting reality check that even the largest fortunes of that Gilded era, by the 1930s, they had been pummeled by the stock market crash of 1929, but also taxes during the FDR administration helped pay for these much-needed social programs that were preventing people from starving. So this house was built at a very specific point in time. But in spite of all the neglect and the abuse, it still has miraculously survived. And my hope that is that, and I know it's an extremely difficult undertaking, but my hope is that gradually it will be brought back to life in some form and open to the public for people to appreciate this sort of design and architecture. I think that neoclassical architecture has been very much pushed to the side, to the margins of today's design language. And I would say that is understandable following the First and especially the Second World War, when the international style became popular. But a lot of the classical language that was used in America since the colonial era, it was pretty much forgotten about, swept aside by major institutions. And the architectural legacy of people like Horace Trumbauer was simply buried and forgotten. I am a believer that good modern architecture and good classical architecture can survive side by side. I think that people should be allowed to choose what sort of style they like. And I think that at the end of the day, when you go to New York City and you look at Grand Central Station, designed by Warren and Wetmore for the New York Central Railroad under the aegis of the Vanderbilt family between 1906 and 1913. That's a building where people are still coming to be in awe and to take selfies in the main hallway. And I think that sense of transcendence and awe, of quality of any style, needs to be brought back because so much of today's aesthetics are flattened by social media, by screens, by the desire to remain as neutral and non-offensive as possible. I think that, these buildings like Lynnewood Hall, although they represent a very specific group of people and a very specific time, I think what they allow us to do in today's age is to experience a feeling of transcendence and awe, of scale and proportion and beauty that we could bring back to our own lives. I think this exists in classical architecture as it does in modern architecture. But I hope that the reappreciation of buildings like Lynnewood Hall would lead to a new rebirth of classical architecture. And I hope that this will help rejuvenate our society. I think we're at a very, unfortunate and kind of bleak moment culturally. And I blame a lot of it on the flatness of screens, the need for constant stimulation. But what I think needs to bring us together as a society are moments and structures and landscapes that bring back wonder and awe and a sense of limitlessness. And although Lynnewood Hall is an example of sic transit gloria mundi, it is also an example of potential. And I hope that it is gradually restored, and I applaud the efforts that the Lynnewood Hall Foundation or Preservation Society has put into saving this building against all odds. I think it's also an important part for me of maritime history and business history, and is intersected in two of my books, A Man in a Ship, where the Widners and J.P. Morgan and the International Mercantile Marine are featured, and also The Last Ships from Hamburg, where Peter Eilbrun Widener is one of the financiers of J.P. Morgan and the International Mercantile Marine and the White Star Line. Thank you so much for listening to Wet Lunch on the High Seas. Till next time, this is historian Stephen Ujifusa.